Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm, as you can tell maybe from that introduction, not traditionally from the media world. I actually have a background in economic history, and so I'm very interested in scenarios like this, which many of you might be able to relate to. But basically in the industrial systems and mental models that we've come to inherit in some of the command and control systems that have really shaped a lot of the industries that we're innovating in. I think a lot of the industries that I've worked in are still very much controlled by the factory kind of discipline of the Industrial Revolution. And so a lot of the work that I do explores a future that is actually creating a very different kind of economic culture, a culture that's more built on principles of informality, that's built on alternative models of governance and greater participation, and that sees a lot of our systems working at a much more human level. So I spend a lot of my time working with people like this, misfits, people who don't fit into the mainstream system and are really trying to forge a new kind of path. Not in media, but working across a number of industries in energy, in healthcare, and in food, I've noticed these trends that everyone is facing, that we're in this period of great transition, this period of enormous turbulence. So industries, not just in media, are rethinking their financing, they're rethinking their cultures of work, they're rethinking their business models. So the pharmaceutical industry, for example, which is sort of past its heyday, is no longer doing R&D. They're no longer doing drug development and discovery. They're insourcing all of this whole process. Within the energy sector, this Goliath industry is on its last legs of big oil. And so the question is, what's next? What's kind of the new wave that is coming in? And how can misfits act as a bit of a bridging species between this old economy and this new economy? And so in particular, I've really tried to work with people who have been incumbent within some of these institutions and are these misfits on the inside. They're the mavericks or the entrepreneurs, and they're really trying to get their institutions to evolve. And for me, at a very personal level, what is the theory of change here? Do we let these old industries die out, or do we try and unlock, almost in Robin Hood fashion, and use some of their incumbent wealth and power to invest in something new? And personally, I think I became a bit disenchanted with this scenario. The idea of always trying to move these Goliath industries, of working through the corridors of power. I wanted to try and distance myself a little bit from the world of formal institutions and instead focus more on informal actors, on grassroots misfits, black market innovators even, that went largely completely unnoticed and unaccounted for in our economy. So I started talking to people like this, to gangsters, to pirates, to con artists, to hackers, to protesters, and I started documenting some of the practices they were using to innovate. And this is a short little video where you can see some of these practices come to life. Beautiful, thanks.
never be this. One law made, 100 laws made to break it.
Beautiful. Great. So the big lesson with this project for me was to really get out of a moral kind of frame that divides the world up into good and evil and begin to see this question of, well, what can we learn from some of these more disruptive and underground approaches to innovation? And so I began to synthesize some of these learnings with my co-author. And, they weren't always the most appropriate to appropriate. Some of the interesting ideas that came from drug smuggling and crossing the border and these kinds of things ranged from having a cannon that would shoot packages of marijuana across the border to homemade submarines or breast implants filled with cocaine. People even used Bibles or wooden kind of peg legs to fill drugs, or a giant frozen squid. So there were definitely examples of rapid prototyping and this kind of trial and error approach, but they weren't necessarily the most powerful. So historically, we started looking at a number of different kinds of misfits. And one of the stories that I really love is about a misfit called Helena Wright, who was an early pioneer of sex positivism in the UK. And she dealt with this issue following World War I. There were many soldiers who came back from war, and they were either infertile because of wounds or were too shell-shocked to perform sexually. And so she was really dealing with this problem of all these wives who wanted to have children but who couldn't. And so she found this man called Derek, and she used basically Derek to go around making fertile various women in London, and she succeeded in impregnating over 500 women, and she ran this as a small business. She charged a fee, and she booked appointments where the husbands of these various women, of these wives, could be home, or they could choose not to be home when this appointment was made. And she was a total entrepreneur in this really seedy, amazing fashion. So we did all this research, and then I was on the tube, and I read this article in the Daily Mail, and I don't know, it was on the tube, so I just looked at it. And they had actually covered this story, so that was a little bit disturbing. But one of my next favorite misfit examples from history, and this is something that I actually use a lot more in my own work, is the con artist, this archetype of, the confidence man, that fast-talking guy who gets you to do anything, basically. And so one of the historic stories was about this guy who sold the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal. Another one of my favorite stories is by this Scottish con man called Gregor McGregor, which sounds like a completely fake name, but it's legitimate. And he attracted all these settlers to a fake country called Poyais, which was near Honduras. So not only did he make up this country, but he commissioned a natural history of Poyais. He made himself a lord. He gave various people titles. He said that the pounds weren't accepted there, and that actually you had to use this fake currency, which you would have to buy from him. And he even made up all these fake ballads. And so he was sort of playing on this Scottish inferiority of the time for not having colonies. And he talked about sort of the Scottish Highland identity and how they needed this colonial nation. So he recruited 240 settlers to go to this totally fake place. He recruited a number of investors. He raised money through this bond, and they had 7 ships go out and embark on this voyage. And sure enough, when they got there, they realized the scam. And unfortunately, many of these people, died there, and only a few made it back. So it was actually quite a vicious kind of experiment. He then escaped to France and continued to do smaller cons. I think this was one of the ones that was the most infamous. But for me, if someone can make up a fake country and get the world believing in that idea and even issue currencies, as someone who hustles a lot and tries to pitch things to various people, it's incredibly inspiring. Pitching is all about making a totally non-existent or possible future real for other people. And so actually being able to appropriate some of these lessons from con artists, making things real, coming into a pitch with a prototype, with fake currency notes or something, rather than just vaguely discussing what you're going to do. So yeah, I feel like with this kind of sentiment, you can do almost anything. But more seriously, there are also a number of misfits who are building out really interesting organizing models. So, hacker collectives like Anonymous, for example, the Occupy movement, they're completely rethinking how we organize ourselves outside of traditional hierarchies of organization and developing participatory governance. Anonymous is particularly interesting to me because they have no membership fee, no initiation, you just claim allegiance. So it's very untraditional, unlike any kind of club. And also, there's not one CEO. Anyone can be anonymous, and no single person is anonymous. And then there are regular actions that are undertaken by the group where they lend the brand to. So you have petitions, pranks, campaigns, and others can opt in or opt out to these actions. So it's a very different way of thinking about informal organization. And I think the Occupy movement, you saw this as well, where regardless of how successful you think that movement was, they were able to nurture a brand that had little tribes within it with very, conflicting at times ideologies, and they were able to develop this kind of governance structure. So what we're really learning from these kinds of people are lessons in decentralized leadership. How do we foster peer-to-peer communities? You see these kinds of models implemented in the open source movement, implemented in Burning Man, and many different kinds of movement brands, even some of what Lance is doing with Learn, Do, Share, for example. Just to reference you again. You come up later also. And so my question really to you is, what would the world look like if we stopped building out formal organizations and started building out collectives, peer-to-peer kinds of organizations? And as we heard from our last speakers, financing is definitely a really big theme. And some of the people that were early in on the crowd financing and even equity financing game were Somali pirates. They have their own crowdfunding mechanisms. 250 miles north of Mogadishu is a sort of pirate stock exchange. But you don't just have to invest capital, you can also invest grunt equity. So you can put in not only your own labor, but you can also offer assets, weapons or useful materials that would be good for a ransom mission, for example. And that can translate into equity as well. And Somali piracy is now more on the decline, so these markets are less lucrative. But it's interesting to see that they were happening they have a similar trajectory to the way that Kickstarter happened. They were happening around these similar times. So ultimately, we were able to distill really 5 principles, and I think one is cut off from your view here, that make up the misfit economy. These are the kinds of behaviors that these misfits operating in all different kinds of economies are using. They are using copycat practices like Shanzai innovators in China. They are hacking systems, so bringing foreign and alien and more disruptive kinds of innovations into mainstream systems. They're total hustlers, they're the guys on the street corners. They're, people in slums in Mumbai selling you things. They have a really diverse portfolio, so they have a lot of different side hustles going on. They're provoking our system, so like Yes Men or La Barbe, which is a French feminist group that wears mustaches, and whenever they go into these male-dominated events, and whenever they feel like, females are underrepresented, they just storm them and ironically congratulate all the men for being men and being there. And they're like amazing performance artist activists. And the last one is pivot, which got cut off, but not thinking of the lean startup kind of pivot, but one of the really interesting characteristics of a lot of these misfits is their ability to pivot across discipline, to pivot across sector, to really make personal pivots at a deep level. So, I grew up with someone, for example, who I would totally classify in this misfit category, who was a prominent Harvard psychiatrist and then started studying alien abduction. Or one of my friends, Kat, used to work in private equity and now works exclusively with ex-cons and ex-gangsters to actually build venture capital mechanisms for them to become formal entrepreneurs. So this idea that part of this process is this ability to go down a rabbit hole and go a little bit into the unknown and come out the other side in a very different kind of terrain. And in my own creative practice, I just wanted to share a little bit about how some of these ideas are playing out. The Misfit Economy is certainly a book. It's working with some old school sort of distribution partners. Simon & Schuster is our editor and publisher. We initially raised around $19K on Kickstarter to get this funded, and now there's a TV series that we're doing in partnership with National Geographic. But we're also developing a whole marketing campaign around spammers. So you know how you get those like letters from people from Nigeria. We're basically going to hire a bunch of those guys and get them to broadcast the word about the Misfit Economy in a fun way. The next project that I'm working on is called Wisdom Hackers, and this is very much disrupting this publishing space. Wisdom Hackers is basically an anti-TED kind of project. It's built on this idea that narratives should be more in beta, that we should be communicating with each other not around all these closed truisms of what we know, but the questions that we don't know. So we worked with an initial community this summer, and each person focused on one burning question that they held, and then they developed this question into some loose thinking that they either developed audio around. One guy who was exploring the question of time went a bit mad and developed an alter ego called Dr. Time, and he stages time interventions places. Another guy looked at how traveled around the US on his motorcycle and talked to people about how we were outgrowing democracy. And so we're working, we're not locking into any one sort of media distribution partner for this project, but we are working with The Pigeonhole, which is a new startup based in Berlin and London, and they do serial publishing. So they bring back this sort of Dickens, Dostoevsky model of reading where you get content released on a weekly basis. Another project I'm working on is a little bit of a joke, but it's sort of a parody of the startup scene to some extent, and it also plays to my interests of cult leaders and religious fanatics. And this idea that maybe a lot of these themes of decentralization that are destabilizing hierarchies can be applied within the religious setting. So I wanted to create an incubator for the next Messiah and really launch this as a transmedia project, have local events where we could do source and selection, working like any other VC and going to places and trying to find these next Messiahs and see what kind of resources and infrastructure we can give them to allow their prophecies to scale and reach the masses. The next project is, again, sort of leveraging the hacker and spamming sort of genres. And, you know, I used to write poetry. Maybe only like 4 people ever read my poems, and my parents didn't even really read them. And so there was this idea of, like, how do we use this built-in marketplace that pornography has to actually give poets access to all those amazing sites where people seem to go all the time. So the idea here was that we would actually hack porn sites with poems from famous writers who maybe don't have built-in market share as much. And so you would get, like, as you're expecting some cum shot or something like this, you would get a poem instead. So this is also super fun. And the last project that I'm working on is called The Amish Futurist, which is a performance character that I do where I dress in Amish clothing and I go to startup conferences, and I just am baffled by this stupid app that someone is creating and bring all this sort of Luddite angst to this conversation of technology, much more in this like romantic kind of vein that John was talking about earlier. And that's been a really fun project of just this idea, again, of identity elasticity, of playing sort of with my own self and conceptions of who I am at a time when we're all becoming commodified brands. And it's also allowed me to really go to Silicon Valley and talk to people in San Francisco and just poke at them and try and like impart more existential awareness about what they think they're doing and what their purpose on this world is, because it seems pretty shallow a lot of the time to me. So ultimately, the Misfit Economy, the sort of the movement behind this is to really offer a new contract to live by. Movement brands are often built on a solid identity, and for us this is Misfits, that we want to find ways of creating bridges between Misfits working on new kinds of disruptive innovations and Misfits within systems that can maybe help scale and bring those innovations to light. So that sort of bridge building is really important. And then there are a number of concrete strategies that we isolated that are just part of the everyday lifestyle of being a misfit. An important one is knowing how and when to camouflage. This is particularly true if you're a misfit in an established industry. Really being able to work in a stealthy fashion on projects. Sometimes when you have too much visibility, that can really lead to the death of a number of your projects. So I was working, for example, with people in BP at one point who were doing all this work on sort of alternative renewable energy, and they were just completely marginalized because they were seen as this sort of sustainability pet child that had nothing to do with core business. So this notion that actually to sometimes be unbranded is really important as you're trying to do this. This was a key term that came out of this beautiful retreat that Lance put together in New York in May called /story, where we basically decided that we were all hyphenated hustlers. We talked about that from a financial perspective and that we were trying to pull in money from a lot of different kinds of places, but that we were also really cross-disciplinary, and so we were part of this emerging future. And so many of the misfits that I've interviewed have this kind of identity. The next thing was really about growing an entourage of support. And you see these in misfit communities, whether it's Hemingway's sort of version of Paris, Warhol's factory, even sort of gangsters who have these entourages, this idea that entourages are really key support mechanisms, particularly if you're working on something emergent. They help to establish new normals. And this is something I do with peers, with colleagues, with friends, is to find people that can help you normalize sort of instincts or intuitions that you have around things and grow fields of practice. And then, of course, gaming the system. So many I'm maybe not as politico, but a lot of the misfits that I spoke to had this really amazing ability to navigate bureaucracies and unlock resources and play these Robin Hood kinds of characters where they were able to really understand how different cultures operate and basically game and hack them for their best interest. And then lastly, just the art of resilience. I think so many people who work against that wheel, that first slide, who work against the system in some way, can suffer burnout. And so it just becomes really important to choose the right battles, to invest your energy correctly, and really ask yourself, is this mine to do? And so a lot of the conversations I have with misfits is just around managing their own well-being and making sure that they're investing their energies in things that are really about the kind of legacy they want to leave. Great, thank you.